Okay, chapter 2. This one is going to start with the British colonies and starting out looking at the reasons for British establishing colonies in North America. So looking at that question and looking at some of the points below it, starting with the English background, the Anglican Church was a mix of Protestant theology with Catholic ritual. 1603 United Kingdom had safe borders under a union of English and Scottish crowns, combining the two. In terms of kind of the social structure a little bit, British rulers did share power with nobility and the gentry, which were a lesser aristocracy. English liberties started out with mostly just knowing that it's a parliamentary monarchy. They did have, if you go back to 1215, the Magna Carta, basic people's rights. Everyone is equal before the law. Parliament had the ability to enact taxes, control tax revenue. And then going into the English enterprise, English liberties inspired this kind of personal initiative and entrepreneurial enterprise, leading the way to using joint stock companies, something that had been around since the Dutch. And joint stock companies is kind of like a modern corporation. Private investors would go in and share in the risk. They put up the money to help fund a colonization effort or group, and then they would also share in the profits that came out of that, using that as an investment. This was going to, joint stock companies a lot of times were those that actually provided for the colonization of America. Late 16th century, there's a huge explosion of British population, a lot of surplus people, surplus workers, and there's not a lot of availability in land and jobs that are open, and so movement to the colonies is going to be a bigger movement. Looking at a little bit again at the history of it, Parliament and the Stuarts, kind of a little bit of the English background. Queen Elizabeth, the last of the Tudors, died 1603. James I becomes the next ruler and basically coined the term Great Britain, merged Scotland, Ireland, and England, and promoted the idea of divine right. Puritans among the English at that point, still very dominant over there, had the Church of England, but it was divided, and Puritans will be basically banished or asked to leave by that new king. Charles I will disband Parliament after James I and try to impose this Anglican worship on the Scots, led to the fall of the king, and he demands more taxes to enforce and defend. He's later beheaded, and during that time in between, brief period with Oliver Cromwell as the Lord Protector who came in, and then he is going to be taken out of power, and they will restore Charles II to the monarchy. Glorious Revolution. After a long era of turmoil, William and Mary, monarchs, take the power from the people, not preaching the divine right ideas, but rather the power for those that govern come from the people. Established a Bill of Rights, and then there was still the movement of ideas of spreading religion and influence that comes along with. So a lot of, basically to sum that up, there was a lot of turmoil, a lot of turnover with rulers, and it's going to lead away to people who were willing and ready to have a change. For the challenges that faced the English settlers in the Chesapeake, settling in the Chesapeake, a lot of the Stuart kings didn't want to weaken, or wanted to weaken the power of France and Spain, and begin to charter more groups, more English groups, to go over and settle in the New World. 1606, James I chartered the Virginia Company. It was a joint stock company assigned to bring religion to the indigenous people, and stockholders also viewed the colony as a source of gold and products, and thought if they could increase how much they were bringing in the profits, that could decrease how dependent the English were on some of the Spanish trade for products and materials needed. Investors within the company are going to promote colonization, trade with the Indians, a place for the jobless vagrants in Britain to go, and also eventually a place to grow tobacco. For a pattern of English colonization, planting settlements and plantations, a lot of times there's conquering people or converting people, but there's not really empires to conquer when it comes to the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake includes the colonies of Virginia and Maryland, just FYI. Indentured servants were a big part of settling the Chesapeake. They were settlers who could not pay on their own. They would arrive as indentured servants in exchange for somebody else to pay their passage to the New World. About 2/3 of English settlers arrive as indentured servants. They are volunteering, to surrender freedom for 5 to 7 years in exchange for that passage. They cannot, usually they cannot marry without permission during that time period. They could be bought and sold, kind of like slaves. But then at a period of time ends, after your contract ends, technically you are free to go, and your person that you were indentured to would provide freedom dues, land, money, something to get you started on your own. In Virginia, 1607, Jamestown was the first permanent colony. Those who chose this colony chose a river in hopes of finding a path to Asia, settled 40 miles inland, trying to hide from the Spaniards. The river was the James River. The colony was Jamestown. The province was Virginia after the Virgin Queen. So a lot of naming in honor of British monarchs. Conditions of this were brackish water, mosquitoes that would contain malaria carrying mosquitoes, a lot of swamp and death that could come from the disease that they carried. Those that were settling in Virginia needed to grow food but were very unfamiliar with farming or manual labor. They were expected to find gold, to make good relationships with the Native Americans, have an easy living, and instead they found disease, drought, starvation, dissension, and death. By the end of the first year, the original population had fallen by over half. We really didn't know how to rely on hunting and fishing. They were saved by strong leadership that came in and trading with the Native Americans, and eventually learning how to farm, especially crops like maize, which is corn. Native Americans in the region, Powhatan, who was chief of the Algonquin-speaking tribes, about 10,000, a little more total. Their Powhatan Confederacy was about 24 tribes, 200 villages, and would trade a lot of their goods, about 80% of the corn they cultivated, for guns, hatchets, swords, things from the English. Speaking of strong leadership, Captain John Smith comes into Virginia settlement and really helped to turn around the colony. By that point, 38 of the original 105 were still living. He's going to impose a very strict discipline. His famous quote was, "He that will not work shall not eat," meaning if you do not help with tasks around the colony, farming, building, whatever it might be, you don't get to share in the food sources of the rest of the settlement. Also set up trade with the Indians and helps to map the region a little bit more. Later, next couple of years, 1609, reinforcements, new colonists come in, including some more women. They were promised free land after 7 years of labor, those that were indentured servants, and also brought in large numbers because of that. The starving time in Virginia was from 1609 to 1610. Most died from starvation or disease during that time, and it started eating anything and everything. Horses, cats, dogs, rats, mice, the leather from their shoes. In some cases, some of them ate the family members that had died. It was not a good time for anyone. A lot of death from that time of winter, of the starving time. All right, so next couple things about Virginia. Lord Delaware, spelled D-E space L-A space W-A-R-R, arrives in 1610 with more men, creating more settlements and bringing in tobacco. Brought the crop in originally from the Caribbean, used some Spanish varieties. John Rolfe was really big in heading up that opportunity. And at first the king thought, it's a horrible habit, it's disgusting, but people really liked it. There's a lot of profit to be made. And it's also extremely labor intensive, so it's going to draw more people in for working into Virginia. Pocahontas played a part with John Rolfe. She ends up marrying him. She marries John Rolfe, dies in London, but is helpful in terms of keeping the relationship friendly between the local Powhatan tribe and the English settlers. More changes are going to come into Virginia when they realize they have to give up the search for wealth and actually start searching for food and cultivating food to survive. They were given the same rights as Englishmen and set up a government. 1619, the first General Assembly of Virginia, the House of Burgesses. This is becomes the first elected assembly and has that responsibility of representative government. Only problem was the only people who could vote were landowners, so it becomes a little one-sided in terms of representation. Over the next few years, a lot of immigration coming in from 1607 to 1624, 14,000 immigrants come in, and by the time that period ends, there's only about 1,132 left. So a lot of people were dying, whether it was from disease or attacks or whatever the case might be. There was a pretty high mortality rate in the region. And for Bacon's Rebellion, as people had begun populating and more indentured servants and people surviving that, which really only about 1 in 10 survived being an indentured servant, in the 1670s, tension began to rise because economic conditions, tobacco prices were falling, there was higher taxes, the wealthy planters dominated politics. If you wanted to be in politics, if you wanted to vote, you had to be a landowner. If you wanted to hold office, you had to have more land to qualify. And so they dominate politics, and they fail to support the freed indentured servants against the Native Americans. If you were a freedman or a freed indentured servant, former indentured servant, a lot of times your freedom dues, the land that they would provide for you would be on the very edge of the settlement in the back country, the farthest away from military protection or any of that. And the attacks that were coming in, the settlers out there weren't getting the support from the leadership in the colony. And it caused a lot of tension between the two groups. The violence began to grow between them. The leadership with Bacon, Nathaniel Bacon, who was a kind of a very take charge. He got together a bunch of the frontier vigilantes. He's very young, he's very ambitious, and decides to try to take matters into his own hands. His rebellion, the governor did not favor what he was doing, and Bacon ordered to arrest the governor, and Bacon's men end up burning Jamestown. When he later dies of illness, most of his rebellion dies along with it. But because of all of this, yes, there was more land for colonists as they began to fight back against the natives, but large farmers were convinced that more people that were enslaved would be more controllable, more reliable as a labor force. And so this is when the transition begins to get rid of indentured servants and in favor of bringing in more slaves. Last part of the Chesapeake was Maryland. Lord Baltimore is the founder, 1634. It was the first proprietary colony, which was owned by an individual. The first Lord Baltimore, Sir George Calvert, converted to Catholicism and sought a refuge for those that were also Catholics. And second Lord Baltimore, his son, Cecilius Calvert, founded the actual colony. Lots of recruitment came of gentlemen as landholders. There were a lot of indentured servants that were more the Protestants. Others, the gentlemen and landholders, the wealthier landholders, a lot of times were Catholic. A lot of large land grants that were given out. And they also had a legislative assembly with a governor and council. Okay. I had some images. Speaking of John Smith and Pocahontas, just a couple of images. And then the colonization, which you can see, definitely settled more along the water supply. Not a lot of city centers. This is one thing that's very true characteristic of the Chesapeake settlements, is there's very few places where you actually have cities or settlements that are grouped together. All these little squares are farms or plantations, so it's very spread out, very isolated. There's not a lot of social interaction, especially if you're one of these dots out here. I'm not really sure what they did, but nobody else wanted to live next to them. John Rolfe, known for tobacco. Tobacco was a saving grace for Virginia, bringing in a lot of money that was needed to sustain that colony. Made it very successful. And then you can see where Jamestown was located. Not quite all the way out to the shore, but a little bit inland a little bit. This is an early map. You can see what they viewed as one of their greatest threats outside, greatest presence outside of their settlement. And then replicas of the housing. That's the end of part 1.